episode of my reading of Geoffrey of Monmouth's The History of the Kings of Britain. So we're nearly through the first chapter. What did we learn in the first chapter? Well, we saw Brutus descended from Aeneas and his Trojan army banished and sent by Diana, the goddess Diana, to the island of Albion, which is another name for Britain. So this is Geoffrey of Monmouth's mythical history of Britain. So we were up to the point where Brutus has arrived at Albion with his army. So let's continue. At this time, the island of Britain was called Albion. It was uninhabited except for a few giants. It was, however,
Dotness then summoned all his strength, for he was infuriated by what had happened. He heaved Gogmagog up onto his shoulders, and running as fast as he could under the weight, he hurried off to the nearby coast. Okay, so we've got a little asterisk there. So it says down here, Dotness on the River Dart, once a walled town with a heavily fortified castle, since the conquest, was already an important port in Saxon times, and saw much trade with Brittany during the Middle Ages. The wharves can still be used by vessels of up to 200 tons. It was there that Brutus had landed. Later on in the Historia, Vespasian, Constantine II, Aurelius Ambrosius, and Utherpendragon all came ashore at Dotness, and so did the marauding Saxons. Dotness is, of course, some 9 miles upriver, and Quirinius had a long way to run with his burden. Geoffrey cannot have known this, but his distances are so often unrealistic. Okay, so back to the text. which is now known as Wales, but which was for a long time after his death called Cambria from his name. As a result, the people of that country still call themselves Cambrai today in the Welsh tongue. Albanactus, the youngest, took the region which is nowadays called Scotland in our language. He called it Albany after his own name. Eventually, when these three had reigned in peace and harmony for a long time, Humber, the king of the Huns, landed in Albany. He met Albanactus in battle, killed him, and forced the people of his country to flee to Locrinus. As soon as Locrinus heard the news, he persuaded his brother Camber to join him in an alliance. Locrinus called upon all the young men of his own country and went out to meet the king of the Huns, somewhere near the river which is now called the Humber. When the two forces made contact, Locrinus forced Humber to flee. Humber retreated as far as the river and was then drowned beneath the waves, giving his name to the stream. Once he had gained this victory, Locrinus distributed the spoils of the enemy among his allies, keeping back nothing for himself except the gold and silver which he found on board their ships. He also reserved for himself 3 young women of striking beauty. The first of these girls was the daughter of the king of Germany. Humber had seized this girl along with the other 2 at a time when he was sacking her homeland. Her name was Estrildis, and she was one of such beauty that it would be difficult to find a young woman worthy to be compared with her. No precious ivory, no recently fallen snow, nor lilies even could surpass the whiteness of her skin. Locrinus was overcome with passion for her. He was determined to make love with her, and even went so far as to suggest that she might marry him. When he discovered this, Corineus was greatly annoyed, for Locrinus had promised that he would marry Corineus's own daughter. Corineus therefore went to the king and addressed him as follows, brandishing his battle-axe as he did so. These then, Locrinus, are the rewards you offer me in exchange for all the wounds which I have received through my allegiance to your father, at the time when he was waging war with unknown people. My daughter is to be passed over, and you are to demean yourself to the point where you will be prepared to marry some barbarian woman or other. You will not do this unpunished, as long, that is, as strength is left to this right hand of mine, which has torn the joy of living from many a giant up and down the Tyrrhenian shores. He bellowed out these words again and again, brandishing his battle-axe as if he was going to strike Locrinus. Then the friends of the 2 men came between them. These friends forced Locrinus to carry out what he had promised, and Corineus was pacified. Locrinus duly married Corineus's daughter, whose name was Gwendolen. For all that, he could not forget the love which he felt for Estrildis. He had a cave dug beneath the town of Trinovantum, and there he shut Estrildis up, putting her in the care of his servants, with orders that she should be treated with all honour. For despite everything that had happened, he was determined to make love with her in secret. Locrinus was so consumed with fear of Corineus that he did not dare to entertain Estrildis openly. Therefore, he concealed her, as has been explained. He visited her for 7 whole years without anyone being the wiser, except those who were the deepest in his confidence. Whenever he went to Estrildis, he gave it out that he intended to make some secret sacrifice to his gods, and he managed to persuade others to believe this, although it was not true. In the end, Estrildis became pregnant and gave birth to an extraordinarily beautiful daughter, whom she called Habron. Gwendolen was pregnant too, and she bore a son who was given the name Madan. This Madan was handed over to his grandfather Crinius to be taught his early lessons. Sometime later, when Crinius was at long last dead, Lacrinus deserted Gwendolen and took Estrildis as his queen. Gwendolen was most indignant at this. She went off to Cornwall, and there she assembled all the young men of that region and began to harass Lacrinus with border forays. At last, when both sides had gathered an army together, they joined battle near the river Stour. There, Lacrinus was struck by an arrow, and so departed from the joys of this life. With Lacrinus out of the way, Gwendolen took over the government of the kingdom, behaving the same extravagant fashion as her father had done. She ordered Estrildis and her daughter Habron to be thrown into the river, which is now called the Severn, and she published an edict throughout the length and breadth of Britain that this river should be called after the girl's name. Gwendolen's intention was that this everlasting honour should be done to Habron, because her own husband had been the girl's father. It thus comes about the right down to our own times. This river which is now called the Maiden's Castle and the Dolorous Mountain. What is more, by the 20 wives which he had, he was the father of 20 sons and of 30 daughters. For 40 years he ruled over the kingdom of Britain with great firmness. The names of his sons were as follows: Brutus Greenshield, Margadad, Cecilius, Regin, most ingenious man who encouraged necromancy throughout the kingdom of Britain. He pressed on with his experiments and finally constructed a pair of wings for himself and tried to fly through the upper air. He came down on top. Of the temple of Apollo in the town of Trinovantum, and was dashed into countless fragments. After Bladud had met his fate in this way, his son Leir was raised to the kingdom. Leir ruled the country for 60 years. It was he who built the city on the river Saar, which is called Cordelia after him in the British tongue, its Saxon name being Leicester. He had no male issue, but 3 daughters were born to him. Their names were Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia. Their father was very fond indeed of them, and above all he loved Cordelia, his youngest daughter. When he felt himself becoming a really old man, he made up his mind to divide his kingdom between these 3 daughters of his, and to marry them to husbands whom he considered to be suited to them and capable of ruling the kingdom along with them. In an attempt to discover which of the 3 was most worthy of inheriting the large part of his realm, he went to them each in turn to ask which of them loved him most. When he questioned Goneril, she immediately called the gods of heaven to witness that he was dearer to her than the very soul which dwelt within her body. "My dearest daughter," answered Leir, "since you have preferred me, even in my old age, to your own life, I will marry you to any young man you choose, and I will give you a 3rd part of the kingdom of Britain." Regan, the second daughter, was determined to wheedle her way into Leir's favour, just as her sister had done. It was her turn next to be questioned. She swore that her only possible answer could be that she loved Leir more than any other living person. Her credulous father thereupon decided to marry Regan with the same pomp that he had promised to his eldest child, and to give her at the same time another 3rd of his kingdom. When she heard how Leir had been deceived by the blandishments of her 2 older sisters, Cordelia, the king's youngest daughter, made up her mind to test him by giving quite a different answer. "My father," she said, "can there really exist a daughter who maintains that the love she bears her own father is more than what is due to him as a father? I cannot believe that there can be a daughter who would dare to confess to such a thing, unless indeed she were trying to conceal the truth by joking about it. Assuredly, for my part, I've always loved you as my father, and at this moment I feel no lessening of my affection for you. If you are determined to wring more than this out of me, then I will tell you how much I love you, and so put an end to your inquiry. You are worth just as much as you possess, and that is the measure of my own love for you." Cordelia's father, who was angry because she had spoken in this way and apparently really meant what she had said, immediately lost his temper with her. He wasted no time in showing what his reaction was going to be. "Since you have so much scorn for me, your old father, that you refuse to love me as much as your sisters do, then I in my turn will scorn you. You shall never share my kingdom with your sisters. All the same, you are still my daughter. I do not say that I shall be unwilling to marry you off to some foreigner, if fate should offer you Soon afterwards it happened that Agenippus, king of the Franks, heard Cordelia's beauty being greatly praised. He immediately sent messengers to Leir to ask if the king would let Cordelia go back with them so that he could marry her. Cordelia's father was still as angry as ever. He said that he would willingly give her to Agenippus, but that there would be no land or dowry to go with her, for he had shared his kingdom with all his gold and silver between her two sisters, Goneril and Regan. Agenippus's love for the girl was not damped when he received this answer. He sent a second time to King Leir to say that he had. Plenty of gold and silver himself, and other possessions too, for he ruled over a third of Gaul. He wanted the girl for one reason only, so that he might have children by her. The bargain was struck. Cordelia was dispatched to Gaul, and there she was married to Agenippus. Some long time after, when King Leir began to grow weak with old age, the dukes whom I have mentioned, with whom, as the husbands sobbed aloud. "Oh, you fates," he cried, "so constant in your own sequences, you who in some fixed course steadfastly follow your own preordained journey. Why did you ever raise me up to happiness, only to snatch it away from me again? It is even more miserable to sit thinking of some past success than to bear the burden of subsequent failure. Indeed, the memory of the time when, attended by so many 100,000 fighting men, I used to batter down the walls of cities and to lay waste the provinces of my enemies, saddens me more than the calamity of my own present distress, although it has encouraged those who once grovelled beneath my feet to abandon me in my weakness. O spiteful fortune! Will the moment never come when I can take vengeance upon those who have deserted me in my final poverty? O Cordelia, my daughter, how true were the words you spoke to me when I asked you how much you love me. You said, "You are worth as much as you possess, and that is the measure of my own love for you." As long, then, as I had something to give, so long did I seem worthwhile to the other two, for it was my gifts that they cared for, not me myself. At times they were affectionate towards me, it is true, but they loved my presence more. Now that the gifts have ceased, these two have disappeared as well. How shall I dare to ask favours of you, the dearest of my daughters? I, who in my anger at those very words of yours, which I have just quoted, decided to marry you off less honourably than I did your sisters. Yet, after all the kindnesses which I have done them, they are content to see me as an outcast and a beggar. At last Leir landed. He kept muttering these things to himself, and many others like them as he travelled to Galicia, where his daughter was. He waited outside the city and sent a messenger to Cordelia to tell her into what poverty he had fallen. It was simply because he had nothing to eat and nothing with which to clothe himself that he had come to seek her compassion. Cordelia was greatly moved by what she heard, and she wept bitterly. She asked how many armed attendants Leir had with him. The messenger replied that he had no one except a certain knight who was waiting with him outside the city. Cordelia then took as much gold and silver as was necessary and gave it to the messenger, telling him to accompany her father to some other city and to bathe him, dress him, and nurse him there, giving it out that he was ill. Cordelia also commanded that Leir should take into his retinue 40 properly equipped and fully armed knights, and that only when this was done should he announce his arrival to King Agnippus and his own daughter. The messenger went back immediately. He led King Leir off to another city and hid him there while he was doing all the things which Cordelia had ordered. As soon as Brutus was the father of the second, Gogmagog. When, after the death of their fathers, these two had succeeded them in their dukedoms, they became indignant at the fact that Britain was subjected to the rule of a woman. They therefore assembled their armies and rose in rebellion against the Queen. They refused to stop their outrages, and in the end they laid waste to a number of provinces and met the Queen herself in a series of pitched battles. In the end, she herself was captured and put in prison. There she grieved more and more over the loss of her kingdom, and eventually she killed herself. As a result, the two young men seized the island, that region which extends beyond the Humber in the direction of Caithness, submitted to the rule of Marganus. The other part, which stretches towards the setting sun south of the river, was put under Gogmagog. Years later, certain people who were tainted with subversive ideas came to Marganus. They started to encourage him to make trouble, telling him that it was a shame and a disgrace that he, who was the elder, should not rule over the whole island. Marganus was stirred up by this grievance and by others of a like nature. He led his army through the lands of Gogmagog, began to set light to one place after another. In this way a quarrel sprang up between the two, and Gogmagog marched out to meet Marganus with all his own army. When the two met in battle, the slaughter which Gogmagog inflicted was considerable, and he drove Marganus in flight before him. Gogmagog pursued Marganus as the latter fled from province to province, and in the end he caught up with his cousin in a remote district in Wales. There Marganus was killed, and to this day the place is called Morgon by the country folk from his name. Once he had won this victory, Gogmagog took over the kingship of the whole island and ruled it in great glory for 33 years. At that time, Isaiah was making his prophecies, and on the 11th day after the calends of May, Rome was founded by the twin brothers Remus and Romulus. And so we have another asterisk, and this says, Geoffrey has already mentioned Rome as being in existence. Okay, let's continue. After the death of Gogmagog, his son Rivallo succeeded him, a peaceful, prosperous young man who ruled the kingdom frugally. In his time it rained blood for 3 days, and men died from the flies which swarmed. Rivallo's son, Gogmagog, succeeded him. Cecilius came after Gogmagog, then Jago, the nephew of Gogmagog, then Geoffrey, the son of Cecilius, and after him Gogmagog. 2 sons were born to Gogmagog, one called Ferrex and the other Porrex. When their father had become senile, a quarrel arose between these two as to which should succeed the old man on the throne. Porrex was more grasping of the two, and he planned to kill his brother by setting an ambush for him. When Ferrex learned this, he escaped from his brother by crossing the sea to Gaul. With support of Suard, king of the Franks, Ferrex returned and fought with his brother. Ferrex was killed in the battle between them, and so too was all the force which had come over with him. Their mother, whose name was Judan, was greatly distressed when she heard of her son's death. She was consumed with hatred for Porrex, for she had loved Ferrex more than him. Judan became so unbalanced by the anguish which the death of Ferrex had caused As a result, Rhodocus, king of Cambria, and Statarius, king of Albany, met to make an alliance with each other. They then led their armies into Dunvallo's territory, destroyed his buildings, and killed his peasantry. Dunvallo himself marched to meet them at the head of 30,000 men and joined battle with them. When a great part of the day had been passed in fighting, Dunvallo found himself still as far as ever from victory. He summoned 600 of his boldest young men and ordered them to strip the arms from those of their enemies who lay dead around them, and then put those same arms on. He himself cast on one side the protective clothing which he was wearing, and did the same as his men. He then led the way through the enemy lines, moving his men forward as if they had actually been enemy troops. He reached the spot where Rhodocus and Statarius were, and signalled to his comrades to attack them. As Dunvallo's men